And welcome back to the Correspondents on Voice of America. I'm Arcega in Washington. Well, the U.S. military claims a series of airstrikes targeting Al-Qaeda's affiliate in Yemen over the past 2 weeks have killed at least 13 militants. But the Pentagon says Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, also known as AQAP, remains a significant threat in the region. Now, AQAP operates with relative freedom on the ground in Yemen because of the current instability in that country. Yemen, just south of the Saudi Arabian border, is mired in a lawless conflict between the Iranian-backed Shia Houthi rebels and pro-government forces backed by a Saudi-led coalition of mostly Sunni Gulf states. Joining us now for more on the Al-Qaeda hotbed that is Yemen today, we have VOA Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb, who joins me in Washington, along with VOA National Security correspondent Jeff Seldin. I'm so glad both of you are here because there's a lot of stuff I don't know about Yemen. Perhaps I've been paying way too much attention to the other group, but Jeff, just by way of background, the president once called Yemen one of our most trusted allies in that region, a strategic partner. How did Yemen get to where it is now?
Well, at one point, the president and other administration officials were touting Yemen as a model for how counterterrorism operations could work, with the U.S. forces present in the country, conducting numerous airstrikes against Al-Qaeda forces there. There is a small Islamic State presence there, but the main terror group that they worry about is
the main player there, right?
Yeah, so they have about 1,000 to 3,000 fighters there compared to just a few hundred for Islamic State.
So given their strength there, what have they done to the capital city? I mean, what is the situation there? We just saw these pictures of people essentially running for cover all over the place. What is the situation like in Yemen today?
Generally, you have the 16-month-long civil war that's been going on between, as you mentioned, the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels and the internationally recognized government that's backed by a Saudi coalition and other Sunni Gulf states, which has also gotten some help from the United States. But it's been a lot of fighting, a lot of back and forth. Not much ground has really been gained on either side. And as terrorist groups are wont to do in these situations, AQAP has been able to take advantage of the instability, take over some towns. At one point, it took over a major port city before being pushed out. And there's a concern that the more ground they're able to take, the more they're able to manipulate the situation, the more of a threat they're going to pose, not just to the region, but also to the United States and Europe.
Carla, I know you've been following these attacks fairly closely. We know that 13 AQAP fighters have been killed. Tell us about these attacks. Was this actually a wave of attacks or a sequence of attacks, say, over like several days or weeks? What happened?
These were over several days between the end of August and the beginning of September. And the reason you're hearing about these strikes is because the Pentagon press corps has been pushing Central Command to tell us about the strikes in Yemen. And we've been saying, you've been telling us about the strikes in Iraq and Syria and now even Libya. Why are you not giving us an update when you strike in Yemen until after the fact? So that's why they're releasing these periodically to keep us informed with the amount of attacks that are occurring.
So what do we know about these 13 Al-Qaeda militants or fighters that were killed? Were any of them high-value targets? Do we know anything about these people?
No word from the Pentagon as to who these people were, but if the United States has deemed them a credible threat and gone through all the proper checks, that's how they determine who they target, not necessarily high-value leaders.
Jeff, these losses for AQAP, minor setback, major setback, what's the impact on the group, on the ground?
That remains to be seen. The U.S. has been carrying, as Carla mentioned, the U.S. has carried out airstrikes for a while. In fact, back in June 2015, an airstrike took out a key AQAP leader, yet the group has continued to persist. What makes it kind of difficult to gauge how effective it is that unlike Islamic State, which has gotten so much of the attention of late, where the focus is on now, intelligence officials have always worried about Al-Qaeda and AQAP in Yemen playing the long game, long-term strategy, and really developing plots and using that as a base of operations, but intending to carry out attacks either on other parts of the region or on the West. And so taking out 70 militants here, as some strikes have in the past, or 13 over a series of strikes over a couple of weeks, does it hurt the group? Yes, but they seem to be resilient enough to have enough new members or enough fighters on hand to go ahead with their plans. And again, they don't feel the pressure of time the same way that you might think of in the West. Their timelines, their need to strike now doesn't exist. They'll strike when they're ready, as long as it takes them to put the plot together and they seem to have some of that room to operate, which is why not only the military but intelligence officials have been so worried.
But what kind of a threat do they pose to that region? And for that matter, do they pose any kind of an existential threat, say, to Europe or even the West?
They definitely pose a threat to the U.S. Remember, AQAP is the group that has tried to send bombs using some printer components to Europe and the West. Also, if you remember the underwear bomber on the Detroit-bound flight on Christmas Eve, where you had a young Nigerian man who tried to blow up his underwear and take down a flight, that was the work of AQAP. They've been very good at bomb making, and just as recently as July, the director of the National Counterterrorism Center said, look, don't forget about AQAP. A lot of the testimony he gave that day before Congress was about Islamic State, but he said AQAP remains, and Al-Qaeda, a principal concern for the intelligence agencies. And of course, they have the abilities as they get closer to the home, closer to the region, to carry out threats there, to communicate with other groups within Al-Qaeda, and to further their goals.
Now, Carla, you've been covering the military developments in the Middle East there quite closely. I know the U.S. military is involved in so many fronts. We're in Iraq, we're in Syria, Yemen, even Somalia. Is there a danger here, Carla, that perhaps the U.S. military is being stretched too thin in that part of the world, that we are expending so much resources in all these different parts that we can't be really truly effective in one?
Well, the Pentagon may not like or agree with the answer I'm about to tell you, but I feel that, yes, the United States military is starting to become stretched way too thin. And here's why I think so, because you look at the testimony from some generals. A recent testimony from an Air Force general said that there are not enough drone pilots to pilot all of the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance runs that are needed for our combatant commanders. Then you look at, in addition to that, he said there were about 500 fighter jet pilots that were needed, in addition to what we already have, just to maintain the current status quo of operations. So the more and more the United States military spreads itself out, that requires even more. And then if you look at other testimony, you can see other people say that the shortfall for drone pilots is really more like 500 in the Air Force when you add other things. And then you've got problems of F-18 fighter jets not being ready to go out and strike. So if you're spreading yourself out and you have less and less resources, you're having a problem. If the U.S. was fully funded and up to capacity, my answer would be different. But the truth is, it's not.
So is this a manpower or a resource issue or a budgetary issue?
It's all of that combined. And until the United States military addresses that, it's going to keep spreading itself thinner and thinner as it does more and more of these airstrikes and more of these surveillance sorties. And it's going to run out of operational power eventually.
Jeff, for the U.S. and a lot of its Western allies, battling terrorism is almost a little bit like playing whack-a-mole, right? I mean, you get rid of one target and out pops another one. Is the military option the only way to deal with terrorism in that region?
Well, the military option is certainly an effective way when you have a group that's big enough to cause a lot of problems. What concerns the intelligence community, what concerns the military, and even the diplomatic community is the fact that how do you get to the causes that allow terrorism to spread, that allow people to get so frustrated that they see that as a viable option? And there really, for some time now, has been no good answer on how to do that. And the problem's only become more difficult with the spread of technology. Everybody who has a cell phone, it's easy to tap, for the recruiters to tap into disaffected populations, and it's easy for disaffected populations to find the propaganda that will lead them down that path.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jeff Seldin. I feel like I know a little bit more about that. Carla Babb, stick around because I need you for the next segment. We're going to take another quick break now, but when we come back, staying on the topic of the U.S. military, the Democratic and Republican nominees for U.S. president squared off this week over who would be the better commander-in-chief. And just a reminder, we want to hear from you. Share your thoughts, questions, and comments on our Facebook page. The address is VOA The Correspondents. We'll be right back.